So recording is in progress. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to Resurgence of Indigenous Liberation Art in the 21st Century webinar with knowledge keeper and artist Albert McLeod. I'm Arlie Ashcroft. I am the Indigenous Programs Manager at Creative Manitoba, and we are located in Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, the Dakota, the Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Metis Nation. I am Metis. We acknowledge and respect the ancestors and the treaties made on these lands by considering all of our culture, traditions, and the history of colonialism, dispossession, and resistance as we create and learn together. The key here is we create and learn together, and that is what we will be doing today. So I'd like to welcome Albert McLeod, who will lead this call to learning. Albert is a status Indian from Nisichawayasihk Cree Nation and the Metis community of Norway House. He's a community leader, an advocate, and artist, sharing his knowledge of new media art and Indigenous cultural teachings, protocols, and ceremony within art and curatorial practices, and also is sort of a specialist in how to decolonize the art world. So with that being said, today Albert will explore the resurgence of Indigenous liberation art in the 21st century. And he will be able to answer all your questions. What we ask is that you write them in the chat, and then afterwards, about 10 minutes to 7-ish or so, we will stop the presentation and we'll get to your questions. All right. And I think that's all I have to say right now. And if for those who missed it, this is being recorded and we will be sending it out to you in the next day or so. Okay. So thank you very much. I'm so glad you are here, and we will give this to Albert.
Thank you, Arlie. Just want to welcome everybody tonight to this presentation. As Arlie said, I do have a sort of colonial history in my family growing up in the park. And my ancestors were here through the Hudson Bay Company fur trade. They were Scottish men who immigrated to Canada and were arrived at the tail end of the fur trade in the late 1800s. And they married into the Cree families who in the north who were also involved in the fur trade. So my identity is very much an Indigenous one, a colonial one as well, in terms of the immigration and the early developments of northern Manitoba. I've been studying very closely with Roger Roulette, who's an Ojibwe language specialist in Manitoba and Winnipeg particularly, and his work around authenticating Indigenous ceremony, practice, traditions, and beliefs and philosophies, using the language as sort of the mechanism to do that, in consideration that the language itself is thousands of years old and predates colonization. So it's a good tool in terms of working with Indigenous peoples and understanding that particular point of view and perspective. Roger told me about a term that deals with spirituality, and it's Miniguwizi Win, which means given or received from the divine. So that implies that as humans, we could petition the natural world, the spiritual world, for things that we need to accomplish our life journey. And again, that predates your Christian beliefs, which were centered on monotheism, or a supreme being characterized as a patriarchal European deity. So we know as the representation of God in the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo, and Adam as the first human. So in terms of that energy of being able to make a linkage with the natural spiritual world, in this idea that we will petition and receive gifts from the natural world. And so a couple of years ago, I was living in the basement of a house with a little window, not much light. And I lived there for 2 years. And in my mind, I made a wish that I would have a view of outside, to see, the sun, the trees, the plants. And in a short time, within a few weeks, I moved to a building on the Red River on St. Mary's Road, where the last 2.5 years I've overlooked the Red River. So I kind of classify that as Minagawisi-win, in that my mind, I constructed the next step in my life journey was to come out of the darkness or the underworld, metaphorically, of the basement, to out into the light and to have a wonderful view of the Red River and be able to watch it through the different seasons. And that sort of process was my linkage to the spiritual world, to the natural world, and evidence that they are listening and able to provide this gift to me. So in examining Indigenous art expression, I ended up not living too far from where Louis Riel actually had a plot of land on the Red River. It's about maybe 3/4 of a block from where I live. And remembering, something that was attributed to him, that he said, in 100 years, it would be the artists that set us free. So that is kind of, an ethic or an approach in doing this work today with you, is sort of visually showing you some of the contributions of Indigenous artists over the recent history and how it plays into our daily lives and the current, politics of our life today. And we happen to be in the midst of a, global pandemic, as well as a lot of information is coming from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, and the recent revelation of the graves of the children buried at Indian residential schools who didn't make it home. So in that sort of context, I'll share my screen and go into the slides that I've prepared. So this is called, click on this from the beginning. Resurgence of Indigenous Liberation Art in the 21st Century. In realizing that Indigenous expression was manipulated, censored, for the last 100 years of the Indian residential school era, and really had to be filtered through, Indian agents or Canada as the state, or the various 7 churches that ran Indian residential schools, what got represented as Indigenous expression. And certainly through the collection of, historical things that were found or still being created post-contact. So it's all about, the resistance to colonization, the preservation of different, Indigenous aesthetics in terms of art, and then how it can be applied to, education, political resistance, and those kind of things. So the framework in which I explore this type of information is, we are all familiar with colonization and decolonization initiatives. And I believe that Canadians generally need to understand the impact of colonization on us, or, mainstream Canadians growing up in the colonial state, especially the Red River settlement, and being objective and have some kind of, perspective on that history, and begin to deconstruct all the things around us that we take as normal or a background noise, and realizing it was very carefully constructed as part of a colony in North America. And then through the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that examined colonization and the impact of Indian residential schools, and then the process of reconstruction from that point of destruction or elimination or erasure, and then moving into indigenization, which some of our institutions are attempting to implement, particularly through the 94 calls for action. And now we have the 231 calls for justice as well. And then finally, centering around Indigenous land-based education, which is sort of the examination of our ecosystems and geographic landscapes and our future as a society in the sort of realization of climate change and those kind of things, the challenges of the future. And then for Indigenous people, reclamation of traditional land and traditional territories. So there's 4 aspects to this particular framework that I'll examine through the lens of various artists. So here we are in the center of North America, as well as our province is called Manitoba, which in Ojibwe Cree means where the spirit exists. And so in working with Roger Roulette, he tells me that for the Ojibwe people, the spirit is amorphous. It's not a representation of our human experience or human condition. Spirits are considered to be wind, rain, lightning, thunder, those kind of things that we can't put in a bottle, and certainly that do not represent the human experience. So for some reason, the Ojibwe and the Cree and the people who lived in this area perceived that there was a spiritual entity, a spiritual power that we could draw on here in this part of the world. Also, historically, we live in the, footprint of Lake Agassiz, which itself, has profound implications on our history, our landscape, our ecosystems, as well as our identity as Manitobans and Winnipeggers. Now, when we look at the population of Indigenous peoples in Canada, according to the 2016 census, there's 1.7 million Indigenous people in Canada. Majority are First Nations people, with 50% still living on reserves in Canada. About almost 600,000 Métis people, and about 65,000 Inuit people. Specific to Manitoba, we have 7 distinct Indigenous groups that all have particular belief systems, histories, culturals, art expressions that we need to consider in working together as we go to the future. So they're the Cree, the Ojibwe, Dakota, Dene, Ojibwe, Cree, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And the total population of Indigenous people in Manitoba is about 123,000, or 18%. And Winnipeg is unique in terms of, it has the highest Indigenous urban population in Canada, around 93 to 94,000 people. Now, some of the work I do is around describing pre-contact structures of family and community. And this is particular to the diversity of sex and gender roles as are found in most Indigenous societies or cultures around the world, whether you're in India, Australia, Samoa, the Philippines, that there was an understanding of male and female energy, whether you're a plant, human, or an animal. The idea of creation of life, which was, determined the difference between animate life and inanimate life. So as humans, plants, and animals, we procreated where the sperm had to shake hands with the ovum. So Arlie, do you know what that's about, when the sperm shake hands with the ovum?
No, I don't.
That's called sex. It's when mommy and daddy do it, and that's how we create it. Now, for most Indigenous societies, there was an interpretation of that reality of life through, observing the astrological world and interpreting that through ceremony or ritual and ascribing attributes of that sort of larger natural world to and weave in the human experience. So here, the sun is representing the male energy or fire, and on the right is the female energy or the water and the moon. So many of the legends, you'll see these sort of interpretations and metaphors for the male and female energy. And in the center is that, the thing that creates life that is really undefined and unknown. Like, we don't know where the spark of life comes from. But if you look in the Sistine Chapel, you'll definitely see an older white European statesman, passing that spark of life to Adam, who doesn't have a uterus. So again, the narrative already gets sort of disrupted in terms of that understanding of that sort of gift of life or the spark of life. Now, two-spirited people, gay, lesbian, trans, male and female, will be on either side of this energy, and we retain some of that ability, right? That's our gift, that's our uniqueness. Then there would be the parental male, the parental female are the ones who bring the next generation, mother and father. And then in most of these societies, people would be given deity roles where they would dance or sing and perform a petition to the natural world to bring rain or to help with the harvest or to make animals plentiful for food. And so these were constructed roles, the ultra male and ultra female, and they were mostly used for ceremonial reasons. And they were drawn from this group of people. So they were presented as, hypermasculine warriors or soldiers, or ultra feminine goddess or a model. So these are pre-contact constructions that were disrupted by colonization. So the legacy of 500 years of colonization of the North American of the Americas is that we're left with this binary gender identity and heterosexism as predominant way of life, and that the church and state were hand in hand in erasing all of these sort of valuable, very complicated, sophisticated social constructions that created a beneficial relationship with the land and the ecosystem. So today we have these gender constructions that are very Western and promoted through media, television, movies, and the arts, that the ideal North American male should be ultramasculine, heterosexual, a warrior or soldier, or from the biblical perspective, Adam for procreation. And then we have the classification of the ultra-female, heterosexual, a goddess or a model, and from the biblical sense, Eve. And so this vacuum is the work that we're doing today in terms of our resurgence, reclaiming and filling in these constructions that were vital to the success of our communities and our families. So today, you could see what happens when you have a gender reveal party, which really speaks to how entrenched this sort of heterosexism idea is that, a couple is having a child, the expectation is the child would be male or female, and certainly heterosexual. And that's why we only have like a pink box or a blue box, and we have a lot of fireworks, and it usually doesn't end well. There's usually a fire or an explosion and those kind of things. So it really lapse back into this binary gender ideal as well as heterosexist approach. Now, when we talk about decolonization and the expression of art, so here's an Indigenous person, just post-contact, you can see it was like the late 1800s by the tent in the background. It is a sort of a company type. It's a mass-produced tent. It's not hide or anything. And you see the thing. So he is posing in his traditional clothing regalia. And on the left, you kind of see what the photographer, and certainly what he wanted to portray to the public, knowing it would be an image preserved into the future. But he has all those aspects of his identity, culture. Now, what I've done, and I've noticed in terms of the sort of point of view is there is a lot of, in the design of the clothing and the pose, is there is a lot of lines that present itself that extend beyond just the physical part of this individual. And that, you know, every aspect of the clothing and decoration has some extension beyond it. Like if you see the pipe, the carving of the pipe, and you extend it, it becomes something larger, right? And with the eagle fan as well, where he's holding it, pointing it down to the earth, right? And then the wrapping of the blanket, which is really a reflection that it would traditionally have been a bison robe, which had great value in the sense that it would be decorated on the outside, and the fur on the inside would provide warmth. So it had a double purpose. It was a piece of art that was utilitarian in the sense that, you know, it was a piece of art that you could wear. And Roger has said the important reason for blanket carrying after contact and the extermination of the bison on the plains was it still represented the bison robe, but also in visiting each other, especially for semi-nomadic people, they would place it on the ground, and that is where they would invite people to come and visit with them, right? So it had another purpose in that it created community and a sense of, family, is that when you laid out your blanket or your robe and invited people to it, it was that place where you told stories and visited and those kind of things. So I just wanted to use that. And this is called What Do You See? Right? So it really is that transition period from contact and the remnant of traditional clothing and regalia in the late 1800s, and the photographers who were able to capture that image prior to, to them being outlawed through, the ceremonies, the Sundance, all of those were outlawed, pipe ceremonies, potlatches for 70 years, from the late 1890s into the 1970s, where these things, you might find them in a museum, but it would be very difficult for people to sort of have those in a time of forced assimilation into Western ways of life. So we're moving into from decolonization into reconstruction. So when we think about decolonization, it means deconstructing our histories. And as I said, that is applicable to mainstream Canadians as well as to Indigenous people. And when we look at language, in terms of this case, we're using English language, there's many nuances we can use to explain the process. So the process of colonization is one of dismemberment, cutting of hair of children in Indian residential schools is a metaphor. The wearing uniforms and not wearing their clothing from home. Being forced to speak English and devaluing of their Indigenous language. It's also a process of dismemberment of the person physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically, which is a painful process, right? So colonization has been traumatic and painful in terms of what was not valued by settler society, what was discarded, and what was made illegal. Now, the process of reconstructing is a play on words, which is really what we're doing today, is we're remembering. We're picking up the narratives of Indigenous artists. We're picking up the threads of culture and tradition that have been preserved, and many in secret, so that we can apply them in the 21st century. So it equates to when you cut away, you bring it back by remember it. So it is growing your hair long, right? Is how you remember. And that constitutes healing that historic trauma, right? So it is kind of a play on words. Now, in terms of sort of Winnipeg, is the attempts we've had in the last, 30 years. We've had the Winnipeg Indian Friendship Center movement started in the 70s in Winnipeg. So sort of the footprint of Indigenous peoples in an urban environment like Winnipeg has mostly been minimized, and there's not much evidence of us being here for 8,000 years, but we are in this process of reconstructing, right? As we decolonize, we reconcile the past and we reconstruct. And a good example is the bringing back of the household, the extended family, the traditional structure of community, the relationship to the ecosystem and the landscape, and then the building of the home fire, right? That is where we go. And as with many cultures, the fire represents knowledge, right? And it's that relationship with the spiritual world. So historically, we had the Patricia Hotel that evokes the era of immigration. Farmers were brought here to create the breadbasket of the world, and they certainly did, and they certainly are hanging on to it. So they were housed when they got out of the train station on Higgins. They were housed in the various hotels on Main Street before they went over to the Exchange District and got their tools, their horses, their plows, and then they went out on the prairie to take up the land and to begin agriculture. Now, in the late 1980s and 90s, there was a move, to create a space for Indigenous people. So the Patricia Hotel, the Savoy Hotel, and other hotels in that part of the Main Street, which again was, very poverty-stricken and a place of exploitation of Indigenous peoples through the various bars that are there and still there, in the creation of the Thunderbird House. So this is an attempt to decolonize, reconcile, and then physically reconstruct in the center of Winnipeg a culturally safe place, a culturally representative place of Indigenous peoples' philosophy and practice. And so this is what we have today, is the Circle of Thunderbird House when it was pristine. And it was designed by Douglas Cardinal, who's sort of one of the world-renowned architects. He has hundreds of buildings around the world. And today, the Thunderbird House is in disrepair. It's never had a renovation. It still has the original cassette tape player in the sound system that when it opened in 2000. So essentially, it really examines this idea of reconciliation from a sort of a governmental level, that we have this sort of unique, artistic creation by Douglas Cardinal that's been neglected by the federal, provincial, and city government for, 15 years, right? And is sort of falling apart in the view of other Winnipeggers. So it's kind of this sort of racist, anti-Indigenous racist thing, is to see like, well, look at this. This is how Indigenous people are, living, maintaining and building in such disrepair. And so, I don't think it's accidental. I think it's intentional by the three levels of government, that this be the legacy of Douglas Cardinal. And here you see the original Patricia Hotel that was torn down. And then you see the Savoy Hotel on this side, which is actually where the Youth for Christ building is now. So you see the difference in terms of the Youth for Christ is pristine, and the Thunderbird House has been neglected for 15 years. Now, the next process is about indigenization. So it's really going back to that early settler construction of the supreme being, where are the 10 commandments, or early Euro-Christian values of church and state, and the impact on Indigenous peoples and the devaluing of language, the sort of erasure of culture, and then the sort of prohibition of ceremonial practice for 70 years. Now, this is a piece of art that sort of goes back to reclaim this idea of creation, particularly the role of women in history, North American history, And this is called The Creation of God by Harmonia Rosales from the United States in 2017. So she's repositioned that image from the Sistine Chapel and rewritten that narrative, particularly in that, especially the North American and the US history really is that, the US nation was founded on the backs of African slave women for over 240 years, right? That's the true story of the founding of the United States. And so as an artist, Harmonia tries to correct that narrative of, the white Euro-Christian male as being supreme or superior, and then by reasserting these particular images of the true Eve, right, who is able to create life. So in terms of the legacy of Canada's history, and when we talk about language and the importance of language, this is about Indigenous place names. So Canada itself originates in the East from an Indigenous language, which means a community or a village. Chicago in the United States means wild onion or skunk place. Manhattan, New York is the island of hills. Manitoba, as I said, it means where the spirit exists. Michigan, big water. Saskatchewan, the sound of fast flowing water. Then Winnipeg, we're in the delta, water, right? And then our river, begins in Fargo and goes up through Lake Winnipeg into the Hudson Space. So that is a north trajectory of a particular river. So you can see in the early years of a settler society, it was a descriptive language, and we retain some of that in the words we use every day, not realizing we're actually speaking Algonquin, Cree, or Ojibwe, or Mohawk words in our everyday life, not realizing what they are describing. And they're describing that early era, that early relationship with settler society. Many who were fluent in the Indigenous language, were multilingual, because that's how you became successful, is that you had to speak Indigenous languages, as well as French, as well as English, if you were going to be successful. So that's that legacy. That's in our everyday consciousness, in the words that we say and use. Now, in terms of working with Roger, this one is more about the philosophy of Indigenous peoples, particularly the Ojibwe, and the four facets of our relationship with each other in a land to survive in a land-based environment. Because if you're in Winnipeg, you know what a 50 below winter is like when it's 50 below outside. You know what the northern wind spirit is, right? And you have to be careful with it. So it really is expanding on the four seasons that Indigenous people navigated as part of the construction of their world and ability to survive and overcome these challenges, right? They were not just human to human issues. It was about surviving the weather or finding food and those kind of things. So the ones that he did, the four primary ones are independence, faith and belief, grace and kindness, and then Vapiwin, survival and overcoming. So now that we are in the middle of a pandemic, global pandemic that was unseen by our specialists, as early as January 2020, and now we're bound with all of these restrictions, and we're kind of having a wake-up moment, is that life just doesn't just go on because we think it's a good idea. We have to relate to the natural world and how complex it is. And certainly, people are hoping that we can come out and relate to each other again the way we used to prior to January 2020. But there's still a lot of unknowns. So this idea here, survival and overcoming is really an Indigenous philosophy and attitude that has guided Indigenous people into the 21st century. This capacity to be, to focus on, Roger says, the prime directive of Indigenous people is the prevention of illness and misfortune, right? And so this particular ethic or valuable relates to that, right? Being very conscious of your environment and your social situation. Now, some of our artists are reclaiming, and in this case, Ray Michel through the Manitoba Museum began to explore making traditional pottery here that was found present here at the time of contact 200 years ago, and slowly died out because there was iron pots and copper pans. And so this craft of making traditional pottery from the clay or mud here in Manitoba I don't think there was any Indigenous Manitobans at that time who were actually practicing making traditional pottery. And so Ray was one of the first ones to pick that up through the assistance of Manitoba Museum. And other artists now, like Casey Adams, as part of her work, is also doing reclaiming that, right? And so she's this, and unfortunately, Ray died in 2018 suddenly. And then Casey is now sort of the current one who is promoting, particularly to youth. And really, it is that aspect of literally returning to the earth and then building art, but it's also utilitarian in the sense that you can cook with it, right? So there's all these facets to it. Now, the smudge, which most people are probably familiar with as a common ritual or ceremony in Manitoba or Winnipeg, especially in our school system, it is about purification in the sense that when we petition the spirits of the natural or spiritual world, that before they arrive, we ceremonially purify ourselves through the burning of these plant medicines, whether it's sweetgrass, sage, cedar, tobacco. In that, we're honoring those spirits that present themselves by making ourselves pure in the relationship that we have with them. In that our journey as humans is only particular to us, not to those spirits. So we do it in a way to show them that, we are not going to distract them from our personal issues, but we are being present to them when they present themselves to us. So the Ojibwe word for smudge is ababaso, which means to draw smoke onto oneself in an act of purification. So this is really different from Christianity, and there's some ceremonies like with holy water and baptism and all those kind of things, but we are evoking or invoking the spirits of the land here around us, right? So some of the artists who have, and this is Jamie Black, and some of her work on the violence against Indigenous women. And that sort of redress began in South America, where there is a lot of femicide, violence against women generally, and particularly Indigenous women in South America. So this is kind of the North American version of that sort of campaign of awareness against femicide and the violence and misogyny inherent in colonization. Euro-Christian colonization. And so Jackie first showed her redress project at the University of Winnipeg in 2011. And this is the installation that is currently at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Now, just in terms of the use of online technology, especially in the context of isolation through COVID. And a lot of, powwows have been postponed, sundances have been postponed. So usually the circuit, North American circuit of culture has been postponed. So people are really, isolated and locked down. And one of the things that happened through Facebook starting last March, and I characterize it as a phenomenon, they called it the social distance powwow, because again, people knew there would be no powwows this year. And today it has over 240,000 Facebook members. And it is a place where Indigenous artists, they have art markets, they have people dancing, singing continuously from North America, showing their children dancing, right? So itself is a response to COVID and to address that lockdown or the separation of people and the breaking of the powwow circuit or the cultural circuit, in that they've created this platform where there's over 240,000 Indigenous people. And I don't think in any time in North American history, there was ever one space at one time where there was a presence of 240,000 Indigenous people. So it's unique in that aspect. So our artists have been busy continuing, whether it's doing beadwork, the resurgence of beadwork itself is a phenomenon. So it is that process of constructing, using what's around you, right? So it'd be, equating it back to making a pair of moccasins for someone who would be going hunting in winter, right? So it was not only purpose, like to gather food, but it was also a particular refined, sophisticated design that reflected the identity of the people who made it, right? And you'll find a lot of those in museums. But in terms of this generation, so it has been passed on, fortunately, to this generation of Indigenous textile or artists in whatever medium. It could be visual arts, canvas on the wall. It could be, making memes or making films. So fortunately, the last 60, 50 years, that transfer of design and perspective and cultural meaning has been passed on to this generation. So, and more recent, we've had observations of the shift more recently to the very simple long cloth skirt with one ribbon at the bottom, and how in the last year and a half during COVID, it's transformed into the ribbon skirt, right? Which is very thick satin ribbons, multiple, sewed horizontally on the skirt to make it very vibrant and alive, right? So, and I really see it, it was a transition from the powwow design to mainstream everyday design and ceremonial use, right, for this generation. So it transitioned out of the powwow into everyday use by Indigenous artists. So here's an example, and these are two little girls from 1947, and they're from Oklahoma. And so you see the skirt here, there's a one ribbon and then an applique on the bottom, right? So that was very indicative of their culture. And you could read these skirts, right? You would know which group these girls belong to. And then you see more recently, as I said, the relationship to the powwow circuit. And so this is a particularly jingle dress, but just even more recently with the finding of the Kamloops burials of the children there, that this person has put an image on here on her skirt that actually shows the school and then the children, returning home to their communities, and just this representation of the birds as a and then the eagle, right? So it is a narrative, it's a story, it's a visual story. And then the literal transformation or transition to what you would consider Western methodology is the visual art, where it's actually a canvas or a construction to hang on the wall as an image or a point of view. So it's really moved from sort of being, a utilitarian classical wearable art to actually something you would see in a gallery. So that's why I call it the making of a canvas, and where this skirt represents that space, that platform where you tell your narrative, you tell your story, and then ultimately transitions here to an actual representation of the ribbon skirt for a display in the gallery. So I also did work with Lita Fontaine, who's one of the fabric artists, and this is the book about her retrospective, and it is translated into Ojibwe. And again, it is, her point of view from attending powwows as a young, she's Lakota and Ojibwe with her mother, right? So it's the impressions of her worldview, of her observations of the cloth fabric dress that women wore at these particular powwows, and her modern interpretations and representations of them in this present era, and sort of some of that description of how you observe a powwow and what you learn from it or take from it. And then on the right here is the sort of as mentioned, many of the prairie people were semi-nomadic, so the art was on their dwellings, and here's a lot of different teepees with different designs, and how that can be sort of linked to either the ribbon skirt or some of the women's dress is that, the sleeves represent the tops here of the teepee to change the wind, right, to catch the wind and those kind of things. And then more recently, the voice of Two-Spirit people or Indigenous LGBTQ people. So Kent Monkman, originally, his family comes from Northern Manitoba, and he has a female persona called Mischief Eagle Testicle. And, initially she began on the right here as a lot of the sort of European landscapes of North America did not show the Indigenous population. So as an artist, Kent, Monkman replaces that, reconstructs that point of view and paints in the people. And these are particularly the sort of gay people on the prairies or in these landscapes, which really was erased as well. The LGBTQ history of North America has been erased over the centuries. And so as an artist, he paints it back in and shows all the shenanigans and the marvelous things that were going on at the time. And then here's his persona as Mischief Eagle Testicle. And here he is in Paris with sort of, he's now retired, this fashion designer, Gauthier, I think his name is. I can't remember, but they had this sort of mock wedding where he marries sort of this Indigenous debutante from Canada, and this sort of reconciling of that past and, the racism or colonization of the Two-Spirit identity in the Americas. Jean-Paul Gaultier, I think is his name. So this is this sort of performance piece they did, and apparently the Parisians really liked Kent Monkman's work. Now, the other piece that Kent was able to contribute is he kind of segued into giving us a view of what we were really prohibited of knowing and seeing. And Senator Murray St. Clair talks about that, right? That Canadian children were educated a particular idea about Canadian history and really left out what was happening to Indigenous children in the residential schools. So as an artist, he paints this view that we were prohibited as Canadians from even knowing happened, but also even documenting, right? And the trauma the pain, the fear, and the violence in that whole process of kidnapping or stealing children from their birth families, and the sort of culpability of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in that process, right? And sort of a metaphor is, you know, during World War II, the German army and the Nazi army, because, you know, Germans were making cameras, that every soldier got a camera, right, as part of being a soldier. And so they documented the Holocaust themselves, you know, that they were not shy of taking photographs of, you know, the extermination of Jews or other people. And so we have that record, which was documented, but we don't have that record for Canada, and what has now been characterized in the last couple of weeks as genocide, and the tool being Indian residential schools. So as an artist, you know, Kent has sort of moved through different themes, and then this one has been very useful to let people know this is what happened, right? You can see it. And so as an artist, he was able to fill in the gaps for us. So we're very close to the end and we have time. So the land-based education piece. So we do have a generation of youth who are very educated, aware about the issues, the anti-Indigenous racism, the resource extraction, the violence against Indigenous women, the homophobia and the transphobia. And so this is a magazine that came out a few years ago, and I think there's 10 issues now, where Indigenous writers, artists come together to create this new view, and you could call it futurism, right? Because truly it is their future. Like, I'm 65, it's not my future, it's their future. And so it is that voice, right? About who they want to be, where they want to be, what they want to be doing, what they want to be focusing on. And certainly there's a large land-based education piece in terms of their activism around the pipelines, you know, the building of dams, the cutting down of old growth forests, all of that. So this generation is really about preserving their traditional territories. And then bringing us into the 21st century and this current pandemic with Ruth Catpand, who's Cree. And so she's done that work of, you know, beating the early viruses and microbes that devastated Indigenous communities at the time of contact: smallpox, diphtheria, TB, and then more recently she's done SARS, she's done HIV, and now most recently she's done COVID. Right? So it's still the same process of making a moccasin, right? So it dates to her grandmothers and great grandmothers who would sit at the table, you know, use their needle and then construct something. And in this case, she's constructing the virus itself. And in this case, takes control of it, right? Creates a relationship with it. So it's not just in the, you know, in the purview of scientists and doctors or governmental people. She claims it and creates that narrative or relationship conversation with it herself by going into the microscopic level and retrieving it and coming out and then presenting it to us as a piece of art. And finally, the last aspect is land-based reclamation. And so we know Camp Young Barracks has been purchased by 3 First Nations in the Treaty Land Entitlement process. And it recently was named Nawe Odina, which means the center of the heart and community. So really it is this energy coming back into the footprint of Winnipeg or the Red River settlement, this resurgence of an Indigenous point of view, an Indigenous perspective about humanism and community and you know, a path forward, right? So this is the design and how it's going to be structured as a community within a community. So we made it safely to the end, and I'll stop sharing. And hopefully, we've been online all the time, I hope, Arlie.
We have been.
That's very good.
So if anyone has any questions, just please type them in the chat, and then we can have Albert answer them. Thank you so much. That was very intense, actually. I was wondering, from my experience as an artist and from working with different artists, most of the people I know who are Indigenous, who we are making art that is political. It seems like there's always a political bent to it. There is a voice to it. Where does decorative art fit in?
I think you can be political and decorative. There's no reason why you can't be, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, no, I value decorative. I find decorative arts are decolonizing. They are healing. And I think they are about ethical space, right? And I like to use the metaphor of the Cree grandmother sewing the moccasins, so someone can go hunting and get a moose, right? And that if there's anything beyond that science and that technology of her life, her capacity to use nature, like the moose hide, the sinew, the needle, to make a moccasin and decorate it beautifully, then she will look up if there's something important beyond that. And so as artists or politicians or Canadians, we're like, oh, look up, look at me, I have something new to say. And she's not going to look up because we haven't attained that level yet. We haven't attained her level or her focus, right? In understanding the relationship with the land and her role as an artist, but also somebody who's invested in survival. Not with other humans per se, but certainly with the land, right? Because if you make a moccasin out of a 1/4 inch moose hide, you can go in the bush when it's -50.
Yeah.
And you can come back, right? So I like to use that metaphor, is that wisdom, and it can be attributed to a man as well, making a fishing net or making a canoe, same thing. If we have something important or different to contribute, they will notice us. But otherwise, they're not. And that's where I think art is. We have to align with those deeply rooted aesthetics and teachings that are very, they're thousands of years old. So, it's a process of discipline, of meditation, of study, where you attain that ability, right? And they become powerful, right? So you can put a painting on the wall and it has energy, right? It has a life. It has an animate, because we make it animate. We let it come to life. We ask it to come to life.
Thank you. Where do you think the whole digital art making aspect is mixing with traditional art practices? Where do you think that's going?
Well, I think it's balancing what we discarded along the way or were forced to discard. So it is adapting. Like we are in the 21st century. We're not 300 years ago, right? So we do have laptops, we have cell phones, we have electricity, right? Where a lot of us are urban people. So that, use what tools are available. And Roger says, the most driver for Indigenous life is common sense, pragmatism, and reason, right? And so if you have, if you want to make a meme, and I make them all the time, do it. It'll keep you healthy. And those are semi-political. And you need an artist point of view, right? You need to, like I showed one with you recently about the vice president, right? And the first girl in segregated school. And it took an artist to make that comparison. right?
Yeah.
And that's our gift, is we have that ability to do that, to educate other people using our gift of art, right? To make a statement.
Yeah, I always feel that's the way that art is statement making. It's also healing. And the fact that everything, ceremonies and was all sort of shut down, like you say, to the 1970s. And do you feel like that's where the big resurgence of art making and like you're saying, liberation art started taking place?
Well, I don't think we can understand what it meant in the 40s and 50s to be threatened with imprisonment when you were not even a voting citizen and you could not hire a lawyer, right? On how that restricted people's expression, right? Like we can't even imagine what that would be like today, right? To have that amount of oppression and fear. Like if you were threatened by the RCMP, there was nowhere to go. You just had to comply. And I don't think we can even imagine today what the implications of that, but that's certainly part of Canadian history, right?
Yeah, Kent Mugman's shows, when they had it at the WAG, I guess last year, breathtaking, really hard view, and eye-opening for a lot of people. But because he put it out there in an artist's voice, I feel that more people saw it.
Yeah.
Like
And
saw
have been, yeah, and have been impacted by it.
Yeah.
Right. So any questions from the
No.
peanut gallery?
Everyone has been very quiet.
That's good.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Albert. I can't thank you enough for sharing all your knowledge and your point of view and your perspective and your teachings to us today.
Yeah, well, it's been a great opportunity.
Miigwech. And to everyone who is viewing, just as a reminder, we will be sending out the video over the next day or so you can go back over it and gather more information from it. And there's a lot of, excuse me, thank yous coming in from you. Can you see them, Albert, on your
Yeah, I see them.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody. And thank you again, Albert. We will be signing off now.
Great. Bye.
Bye.